At the 2018 OTT Conference in London, we had the privilege of welcoming Ruth Levine as a keynote speaker. Back then, she talked about the moral case for evidence-informed policymaking, and it's a conversation that has stuck with us since. But we did not record her keynote back then. So we are delighted to welcome Ruth as a keynote speaker again today. Over the years, Ruth has been a close friend of OTT, as an advisory board member, funder, and in her new role at IDinsight as a colleague and friend. I think Ruth is well known in our community, but I should say a few words. Before joining IDinsight, Ruth was a policy fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Prior to her fellowship at Stanford, Ruth led the Global Development and Population Program at the Hewlett Foundation, and before that, Ruth worked at USAID and the Center for Global Development in Washington. I could go on about Ruth's impressive career trajectory, but I think we are all here listen to what she has to say about ethics and integrity in the work of think tanks. So welcome, Ruth, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. It's really great to participate in this event. We face the rise of illiberal democracy in many parts of the world. And in some parts, we're seeing the power of straight up anti-democratic forces. We're also seeing many funders who are providing support to think tanks in pursuit of a particular agenda and have expectations of direct policy impact. Because of these dynamics, think tank leaders who are trying to protect their reputations and contribute to the use of evidence for sound public policy making face a lot of tough choices and trade-offs, and those are becoming more acute every day. So the choices are difficult because of the special position that think tanks have in the evidence ecosystem. They cross boundaries. They span the pursuit of knowledge as an academic institution does with the application of evidence in policymaking. They sit between the independent demands of civil society on the one hand and the protective armor of a political administration on the other. You know, they're public intellectuals on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and private advisors on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It is, in fact, in being this kind of boundary-crossing institution that think tanks create their greatest value. But as they are boundary crossers, think tank leaders need to think really carefully about whether they are positioning themselves in the right way. Are they too far away from public policy making, the sort of ivory tower problem? Or are they too close to politicians? That's what I want to talk about today, that second problem. How can think tank leaders establish and sustain their organizations' ethical, high-integrity relationships with politicians and policymakers? That requires boundary crossers to establish bright lines. To put a fine point on it, think tank leaders have to figure out first whether to work with governments that have a mixed or even really bad record about the issues you care about or other issues. Second, what work to do out in the open and what work to do behind the scenes. And third, how to mitigate the risk of being captured by a political agenda that can compromise the integrity of your research. We can't be fully removed from engagement with highly imperfect governments or directive funders. That's just the real world. But we also can't become fully entangled with them. So how do we strike that balance? Let me start with the first question. How does a think tank work with governments that are behaving badly? You know, I don't know of any political administrations or legislatures that would pass a purity test. Bismarck said, politics is the art of the possible, the attainable, the art of the next best. Because of that, all think tanks face moments when the government in power is adopting a pro-social agenda in some areas and problematic policies in others. Or they may be rhetorically on the right side, but in action on the wrong side. There may be pressures in those cases from either within or outside of your organization to publicly criticize the government or at least to cool off existing relationships. In these moments, it's really important to uphold high standards, but realistic ones. The bright lines to draw are around the domains of expertise and engagement that you and your think tank have. That is, basically stay in your lane. Consider what policy issues are within your span of expertise and influence or very close. For example, if you're working in education policy, that would also likely include a broad set of child and family related policies and maybe civil service related policies, given how many government workers are teachers. But it would exclude probably immigration, military, or environmental policy. Within your span of expertise and influence, you can legitimately make judgment calls about whether the government is acting basically in constructive or destructive ways. If the government demonstrates some openness to evidence or ideas or has an agenda that's reasonably well aligned in the areas in which you work and those kind of related areas, it's reasonable to ignore, to kind of turn a blind eye to other policy domains and therefore to build relationships. If, on the other hand, the government is acting in a destructive way within your kind of policy space, you really do want to be careful that the work you're doing, the events you're holding, the reports you're putting out, the private conversations you're having, are not being used to sustain harmful actions. You may well be advised to become a vocal critic under those circumstances. There are more extreme situations, and I'm sure we can all kind of nod knowingly about governments that have gone so far off track politically that they are undermining core ideas that animate our work on evidence-informed policymaking. These are governments, political administrations that are fomenting conspiracy theories, punishing enemies with violence, committing grand corruption. Here, there are harder, bright lines that must be drawn. When the current political administration is eroding the very idea of truth and not even making a weak attempt to advance justice, think tank leaders need to at least temporarily abandon boundary crossing as a model and instead ally themselves with independent civil society groups. Or there may be opportunities to move to work with different levels of government, whether it's provincial or state, local, municipal, in which political leaders are behaving responsibly. Now for the second question, what work do you do out in the open and what work do you do behind the scenes? Most think tanks adopt a sort of insider-outsider set of practices to inform and influence policy. They publish working papers and briefs, they hold public events to draw attention to a particular research product or an issue. They also have behind the scenes discussions with lawmakers or other politicians and public officials to bring research to the attention, to get it in the right hands, or to provide expert advice. These are both legitimate tools of communication, but private channels can be risky. To protect the organization's reputation for independence, which is a prized asset of most think tanks, even those that are partially funded by government, leaders need to conduct a thought experiment. Let's just call it the headline experiment, and that sort of tells the tale. If it were to become publicly known that you had particular private conversations, would your legitimacy, your reputation be undermined in a fundamental way? Thinking through that question can be aided by consulting with outside advisors in particularly tricky cases so that they can kind of give you a sounding as a proxy for how the general public might perceive things. Here, the bright line is, if your public reputation would be damaged, if the behind the scenes conversations hit the headlines, that contact should be avoided. And now for the third question, how to mitigate the risk of being captured by a political agenda that can compromise the integrity of your research. Most think tanks, even the ones that do have a specific kind of policy agenda that motivates their work, need to produce research of high quality to maintain their relationships of trust with the policy community and the general public. They can't be propaganda mills. This means that the methods have to be Sound based on the traditions and the disciplines in which you work, whether it's economics or political science, public health, or others. It means that the data need to be collected using accepted methods and represent the people that you say they are representing, and that the conclusions that are drawn are based on empirical evidence. But think tanks aren't academic institutions, and the risk of having the research captured by politics is very real. And it represents even more of a threat when funders are pushing, or potential funders are pushing, a forceful and narrow agenda with predetermined conclusions before the research is done, or sometimes before it starts. So what might this look like? Well, it might look like suppressing a negative evaluation of a favored government program in fear that your access will be cut off. Or it might look like spinning questions in a public opinion poll in a way that you know will get particular answers. So I have confidence that you're not actually doing this, but we all can think of organizations that make a practice of that kind of so-called research. More policy-based evidence-making than evidence-based policy-making. For this, there are several bright lines to draw. And the first is about funding, and it's quite fundamental. Do not take funding that is contingent on a particular research result. Full stop. The second is about staffing. You need to fill research positions with people who are, yes, trained in good quality research, but that also are part of professional communities, typically academic communities, where research quality is highly valued. A lot of the risk mitigation around research quality has to do with the intrinsic incentives of the people who are doing the research. And so you want to be working with people who see their social capital as being tied to high quality research. The third is about transparency. You need to commit to peer review, or the version of that works for a think tank, transparent methods, sharing data, and making public information about who is funding your work. Think tanks have a really special role to play in the larger policy and evidence ecosystem, spanning those boundaries in ways that have the potential to make consequential decisions better than they otherwise would be. To play that role, think tank leaders have to figure out whether and how to work with imperfect governments, how to be both public intellectuals and private advisors, and how to retain and sustain a commitment to quality in the research that they do. Good think tanks and researchers stand in this middle space and know that they can be tugged too hard in one direction or another. They create and respect those bright lines to prevent them from being pulled over into the wrong place. So all of this is important because you want to keep your organization in business, but there's a larger motivation. You need to do this because of the importance of what we're all working on, that has the potential to impact hundreds of thousands, millions of people's lives. Through their work that they do, influencing public policy with the best available data and evidence, think tanks help shape whether kids are educated, whether doctors and nurses are available to care for the sick, whether the elderly have pensions, whether young people have jobs, whether the air and water are clean, and whether countries have friendly relationships or go to war. These are huge, huge topics. And while they may seem kind of a world away from the daily decisions about what work you do, how you do it, who funds it, they really are not. You have to pay attention to those decisions so that you can be the best possible influence on these huge world-changing issues. So we're all counting on think tank leaders to make those decisions in the best possible way, upholding these very high standards. Thanks very much.
Hi, Ruth. Nice to see you again. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I have a couple of questions, follow-up questions on your talk. I think the first thing that comes to mind, so thinking about this, is that there's something in think tanks' stated purpose, right? To inform, to influence, to bring about change, that I think maybe creates incentives against a more cautious approach, or maybe incentivizes for an ends justifies the means approach. What is your reflection on this, and have you come across organizations that sort of accept this as a given? Like, we have to push the boundaries, and well, if we cross some ethical line, well, so be it. But there's a greater purpose we have in mind. And have you come across organizations of what is your reflection on this? Whether the mission itself is incentive towards crossing those ethical lines.
Yeah, thanks very much, Enrique, and thanks for letting me participate in this virtual event. Wish that I could be with everybody in person and hear and learn from them directly. So I'm not sure that I would say that there are incentives to cross ethical lines exactly. I think what I would say is that there's a real need for think tanks to be highly relevant to current policy debates and to be able to speak with, inform, influence public officials and politicians. And so, as I tried to convey in the talk, in doing that, they kind of edge into murky ethical space. And I think the challenge is that it can be too easy to maybe in pursuit of having that influence to lose sight of a larger picture. And that larger picture is this a government we should be trying to influence in this way? Or should we align ourselves with more visible opposing forces and try to get a larger shift in the whole public policy space? And, I've certainly seen this, in my own, now I can speak, retrospectively about what happened in 2016 in my country when the Trump administration came in. I think a number of think tanks that had perhaps had significant entree and success with the Obama administration tried to figure out, well, how can we work with this new administration, maybe the way that they had worked in the past with Republican administrations, and, kind of behind the scenes and trying to build on whatever relationships and areas of common interest there were. And I saw a number of organizations really struggle over the first, year or so of the Trump administration, trying to figure out how, if at all, to play that behind the scenes role. And many ended up sort of abandoning that because it both proved futile, and I think that there was a reflection that it was somehow perhaps supporting a whole administration that was deeply antithetical to the idea that think tanks have as their animating force, which is that empirical information and knowledge should inform public policy.
Right. You also, you start by your first recommendation is about funding. I had a comment there, but let me ask you a question about funders in this. And you've been a funder. You've worked in a large foundation that supports think tanks around the world. And do you think that sometimes unintentionally, funding to think tanks with the intention to bring about change might be encouraging or pressuring grantees to pursue strategies that might be risky, to pursue ways of working that might involve, for instance, working behind the scenes when you should be more public, not disclosing all the information that should be disclosed. And I wonder, what could funders do to ensure that their grantees do not risk their integrity or do not cross those lines?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Yes, when I was a funder, I observed both how the Hewlett Foundation kind of thought about how to support the work of think tanks and how some other foundations did as well, because many of the organizations that the Hewlett Foundation supports, well, any of them are also supported by other funders. And so there's a lot of kind of interaction among funders about particular organizations. And so the recommendation here is perhaps the most time-worn, well-rehearsed recommendation that is rarely adopted, which is multi-year general operating support that permits organizations to pursue agendas in ways that both take advantage of opportunities and also reflect independence from a funder's very particular agenda. So that's the best advice. Give it often, give it early and often, and we'll hope that increasingly it's taken up. I don't have a lot of hope around that at the moment. So short of that, I think that the most important thing is for think tanks to really make it clear to funders that they are going to not sort of turn into predictable sources of advocacy for specific policy agendas that may correspond in a very particular way to a funder's agenda. And I think that funders, now this is kind of a broad category, but I think that many particularly mature funding organizations understand that part of the source of power of think tanks comes from their credibility, comes from the fact that they're not always predictable in what their policy recommendations are or what their findings are. So I think that there's a conversation to be had. So on the funding side, more general operating support, more multi-year support, and engage in serious conversations with think tank leaders about how flexible or not the support should be. And on the part of think tank leaders, I would just encourage you not to assume that funders will only provide support if you kind of reflect their specific agenda.
And it's a tricky thing, because I in my experience, I think a lot of the times funders and think tanks come together. There's a coincidence of thought. There's an ideological coincidence, right? You don't think kind of a liberal think tank, so a liberal funder would go about funding very conservative organizations. They would naturally be drawn to organizations that are dealing with the issues they're interested in, be maybe using methods that they already perceive as being credible and trustworthy. They trust their experts, their leaders, etc. So there's already a coincidence, and so I think there's already an expectation of what the think tank will do for me. I will fund this organization because, well, I don't think they're going to come up with a conclusion that goes against our principles or objectives, right? So it's hard to define when someone has been captured and when there is that coincidence of interest, of thought. And I wonder if there's a comment or reflection on how transparent think tanks are about not just their funding or their research methods, but about their ideology. And I think there's an assumption there's a discourse we come across a lot about think tanks saying, no, we are neutral, we're politically neutral. We go wherever the evidence takes us. At least I have the view that this is not possible. Everybody has ideologies. And I think think tanks sometimes are open about them, and where they stand on any issue. But sometimes they try to keep their positions very, very quiet, very close themselves, and very opaque. In a way, I think it's a good strategy to capture different sources of funding and not not see any policy doors closed in their faces. But this might also be, might complicate things, right? Make things a bit, make the waters a bit muddier, and make us think that they're being captured, maybe. Or if you're a receiver or the user of the evidence, you might not entirely know, if there's anything behind what they're advising. I don't know if you have any comment or reflection on that.
Yeah, I'll offer a few thoughts. I'd love to sort of hear in the chat thoughts from others as well. I don't know to say the least, every context. So a couple of thoughts. One is that, I think it is certainly the case that there are lots of think tanks that take a particular stance relative to the role of government. So they're libertarian, or they're, kind of conservative small government, large private sector, or they are more, kind of dependent on the public sector or they think about the public sector as the main strategy to solve social and economic problems. And so I do think that, funders tend to then gravitate toward one or the other kind of broad position that the think tanks occupy. I think that is a perfectly fine way to work. My kind of concern would be if funders really drive a very specific policy agenda. So say something about, deregulation of tobacco or of fracking, and they fund research very specifically on that topic, and they time it, they request that the think tank kind of time it to fit a particular policy moment. That, I think, really, really crosses a line that just generally funding organizations that basically align with your political philosophy does not. So that's one point. I think what you were asking is also about whether kind of transparency about think tanks' fundamental ideological position is better than pretending or taking the position of being ideologically neutral. And I guess I would say, again, I'd love to hear from others, but I would say it is better for think tanks to make clear what their understanding is, what their belief is about the role of government. That's the kind of core kind of transparency that is important, because it kind of shapes almost everything, all of the ways that they would then be asking the research questions.
Great. So let me read out some of the comments and questions. Alba Gomez asks, it'd be great to hear additional thoughts on accepting funding from non-democratic governments. Whilst we understand the ethical dilemma, others argue that it is think tanks' role to keep the communications channel open when governments stop talking to each other. A way of legitimizing the project could be to bring democratic government to the table as a joint effort. So, but I think there's two things here, right? One is accepting the money, and the other one is keeping the communication channel open with a government that might be undemocratic, right? Assuming that being non-democratic is against your own values, right? Would you separate those two things?
Yeah. Well, a couple of thoughts here. I would, first of all, apply that headline test or the headline experiment that I mentioned. So if you were, if you saw the source of funding in the headlines, would that undermine the credibility of what you're doing? And if it would, you really, truly have to think twice about this and really, kind of look deep into your soul about whether you want to accept the funding. Second, I think there is relatively little funding that doesn't come without strings. So the accepting the funding is, I think, really quite a questionable route. On the question of whether sort of working to keep lines of communication open, particularly maybe like sort of shadow negotiations or track 2 negotiations. I think it depends on the specifics. it sounds like that's not, sort of crossing any particular lines to me, but it certainly depends on those specifics.
Yeah, I guess it's I think you say it's an exercise. We have to exercise our kind of ethical muscle, and with every case, you have to reflect on what would be okay and why, right? Something somewhat similar, in a similar line, Edgar Rodriguez from IDRC, he asks about think tanks being shy to advertise some of their funders. And I think this applies to foreign funders in certain countries, but also applies to certain funders in certain domestic funders. So, you might not want to advertise the private sector is giving you funding for your work. And they tend to be afraid that they are publicly acknowledging pressure from these foreign actors or from private actors. At the same time, funders want and sometimes need to be acknowledged to justify providing that funding over and over again. And so I guess this is more of a practical question from a more fundamental reflection. But what do you think? What would be your advice to think tanks when walking this fine line? Is it that headline test again? What would happen if people did find out that you were getting funding from these sources all along and you had not disclosed it? Is it better to deal with it now, right at the beginning, than hope that nobody finds out?
Well, I think being transparent on the funders' part about who they were supporting and on the organization's part about who is supporting them is a very important part of their organizational credibility. And, we've seen in the research transparency movement much more broadly that one of the first things that is demanded, say, by journals and in the academic sphere is the answer to the question, who has funded this work, because of the potential perceived or real conflict of interest. And so, yeah, I don't think there's a strong argument for not disclosing who your funders are.
Maybe there's a stronger argument for funders being sort of cautious about how they provide funding and what they can do to help their grantees to disclose information about their funding in a way that does not put them at risk, right? That does not put them in any potential harm now or in the future. Arjun, sorry.
Yeah, can I just say that
Yes.
I think that one
Yes,
to manage things is to really focus on diversification of funding. So, for example, if you're an organization that takes funding from the corporate sector, very, very complicated if you're only taking funding from one company or, the pharmaceutical industry or the, oil industry, and instead, sort of creating a corporate circle that where you are accepting unrestricted support from a number of different kinds of private sector actors. That's a much safer ground to be on. Yeah,
true. Well, easier said than done to diversify your funding.
Yeah,
that is one of those holy grails in think tank land. Another question from Marian, also from IDRC, and he's asking if the pandemic might have strengthened the case for that long-term general support. What is your view on that? And the importance of this is that long-term general support might give think tanks that space to take make ethical choices about how they do research and how they influence policy as well. So,
yeah,
a big factor.
Yeah, I mean, there are every possible argument for long-term general operating support. And the Center for Effective Philanthropy recently came out with a report saying not only is that better for nonprofits, but most foundation leaders know it is better for nonprofits, despite the fact that that is often not the practice that they themselves deploy. So it's sort of, this endless conundrum of why it doesn't happen. I think that, the disruptions associated with the pandemic have certainly exacerbated some of the vulnerabilities of all nonprofit organizations. And so those that have had general operating support have a little more flexibility. I will say that my read is, and our experience at IDinsight is that even the funders who are providing project support have been very flexible in this moment, just recognizing that there are lots of factors outside any single organization's control. So I think that there has been actually a pretty broad responsiveness in the face of the pandemic. Whether it will extend to kind of whatever normal looks like over the years to come, I do not know.
Just a follow-up question before we to transition out of this section, but why if the leaders know it's better for their grantees, don't they provide more unrestricted long-term funding?
I do not know. So, I had the benefit of working at the Hewlett Foundation, where everybody from the board down through the entire program staff understands the value in many cases of long-term commitments to organizations that are doing excellent work, provided in a way that gives them the flexibility to both keep the lights on by supporting all of the needed overhead, so-called overhead, and the flexibility to pursue the agenda that is associated with their core mission. So, I have observed and now experience at IDinsight the challenge of finding other funders who have the same philosophy. There certainly are some, and to some extent there is a lot more discussion about the value.
Yeah.
But I encourage people to look at the Center for Effective Philanthropy report, which tackles this question head on and comes to the conclusion, wow, why don't people do what they know they should do?
Right. Let me ask one more question before we go. Julie France follows up about funding diversification. I think presents a different perspective on this issue of integrity. Is that, by diversifying your funding, you sometimes end up picking up different projects and different funders' priorities, to make up for that budget that you cannot, fully, complete. And that might affect the integrity of your own agenda, right? So what are your views on how think tanks can stay true to their agendas, while pursuing this diversified set of funder interests? I mean, as a reality, right, you have to kind of accommodate to what they want to fund.
Yeah, so I don't have any magic solutions to this. I think that the approach I'd recommend is for think tank leaders to try to persuade their funders that supporting a program of research is superior to supporting a very specific short-term project. And so what does that mean? That means, a program that corresponds to a sector, sort of like, the health policy program or the education policy program or social protection. And, that's not going to be successful in every case, but it sort of splits the difference a little bit between, a funder having a particular area of interest, needing to correspond to that and wanting to have the flexibility. And I do think one of the things the Center for Effective Philanthropy report shows is that a lot of foundations, now these were, I think, all US foundations, a lot of foundations sort of see providing program support as approaching doing what they know they should do, which is providing much more flexible general operating support. So I guess that's where I would go. And, just one thing I want to say, I think, I've been on both sides of the funding table, and it is very tempting when you're not on the funder side, when you're on the nonprofit side, it is very tempting to feel as though you are powerless with respect to funders, but that just is not in any way the case. You are often, any given organization is often making a really unique contribution and providing either services or perspectives or building on relationships that are unique to them. And so I really encourage think tank leaders to kind of own their power within that relationship and not kind of make assumptions that because you need to pay the bills, you need to be in a kind of submissive position with respect to funders. It is a relationship, and you should take on the role of negotiating in the context of that relationship.
And not end up doing anything you didn't want to do in the first place.
Right.
And I've just shared a resource developed by Transparify, which is an integrity health, and what it does, it presents you with a number of scenarios. You can download it, and it has instructions on how to run these sessions within your organizations and also with partner organizations. And it's an excellent tool to exercise this sort of ethical muscle, is to put yourselves in these situations and say, what would I do? What would I do? What would I say to that funder that is requesting me to do something that I feel uncomfortable with? What would I say to a researcher in my team who wants to do something that, well, we're not quite sure it's the ethical thing to do? How would we deal with any situation? I think it's useful for organizations to think about these things every once in a while, and not just sort of wait for that moment when they are in that situation. And it's saying no to a lot of money, or saying yes and then dealing with the consequences later. You might not have the time to think about what your policy is when that happens. So thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you very much again for your time and for your thoughts.